Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a tag of sorts. This is the Your Favourite Authors tag, which was started by Alex at What Page Are You On? And I saw Jen at Insert 3 Puns version. Basically, it asks you to think about your favourite authors in three categories. To choose 6 from the not quite your favourite authors, then 4 from the maybe, and then 5 of your favourites, and to rank those. And the usual caveat that I'm sure most booktubers make is obviously this is as of today, September 2019. It could quite easily change. I'm not quite sure on the difference between the maybes and the not quites, so I've sort of tried to interpret that. So let's sort of get started on the not quites. So this is in no particular order. So I'm going to start with William Burroughs, who I haven't read bar one book, which I'll talk about in a minute, for many, many years. He was a very formative author for me. I read him in my sort of early 20s and began to see about the possibilities of what novels and anti-novels in a way were, and really enjoyed them. I didn't always understand what was going on, such as the sort of the cut-up technique. But there's nothing really more for me to read until last year. A book came out called The Revised Boy Scout Manual by Burroughs, which had been put together from transcripts of readings that he gave, but had never been committed to a formal book, and they were sort of put together with the reading tapes plus his notes. And, you know, not having read Burroughs in 20 odd years, it was very pleasing to have it all gathered together. Quite a short book, it's only about 120 pages long, where the sort of the kernel of everything about Burroughs's art and his views and his values are contained within this book. And it's still, you know, even though, as I say, it sort of brought together all the stuff about Burroughs, it still was a really satisfying read. So that's why Burroughs is in my not quite. Next up, Sam Shepard, the playwright. So before I started being a prose writer, I wrote plays, and I devoured a lot of plays, both sort of going to see them in the theatre performed, both sort of professional and amateur and student level. But also I read a lot of play scripts and analysed them, and for me Sam Shepard was definitely one of the best. Although it's a certain section of Shepard's work, it was up to and including True West, which is perhaps his breakout play that sort of made his name go sort of more global than it was otherwise. And a lot of the plays before that were written in exile when he was living in Britain, and they're really interesting and much the better for it because it's him as an American outside of America but looking back. So plays like Geography of a Horse Dreamer, City of Angels, Suicide in B flat, just really tremendous. And what I liked about them more than his later plays were much more about relationships. I think he wrote the screenplay for Paris, Texas, and they were much more sort of about relationships, which were in his early works, but his early works had a single overarching visual image or set of visual images, and they, you know, that's what made them really interesting for me, and particularly to see them staged. So, for example, City of Angels, which is about Los Angeles and the sort of corruption and the sort of celebrity and film industry, ends with the stage filming up this sort of green slime. It's just a brilliant theatre image. Or Suicide in B flat, where there's a body of somebody who's died, and they've done a chalk outline, which I appreciate they don't use anymore in policing, but when it was set, and characters sort of go in and out of the play and lie down within this chalk outline because they want to change who they are, they want to become somebody else, and it's just, again, a tremendous achievement. And then also Suicide in B flat, Shepard was very taken with jazz, particularly the jazz of Ornette Coleman, and that sort of feeds into his work from that period. So Sam Shepard, unfortunately he died, there won't be any new plays, but as I say, I feel his early work is much more impressive than his more mature work, which is why he's a not quite. Jeanette Winterson is my third not quite. So I've read pretty much everything by Winston except, oddly enough, her first novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, because what I like about Winterson is her sort of, she's not magical realism, but she very much sort of flight of fancy. But what I really like about her is her poetic language. She writes the most tremendous metaphors of love and relationships. But until Frankenstein, her latest book, you could always recognise a Winterson novel because of the language, because of her turn of phrase. So that's why she's a not quite, because they're all, you know, she doesn't do different things, I find. But Frankenstein, interestingly, does play it more straight, and maybe that's an indication that her future novels might sort of, you know, veer away from her sort of fairly hermetically sealed body of work and style. Fourth on this, Albert Camus, another person who can't write any more books to elevate him into the next category. Again, very formative. I read him before I read Burroughs. In fact, it was the first grown-up book that I read was L'Étranger. Then I read The Plague. And just, you know, fantastic writing. I read his philosophy book, The Myth of Sisyphus. A great thinker, introduced me to existentialism. But his novels are very, very good. And his short story collection, Exile in the Kingdom, is really good. There's one really brutal story in there about guys who are captured, I think, by Tuareg tribesmen and sort of, you know, buried up to their neck in sand in the desert, and sort of honey's put on them for the ants to come. And it's, you know, a chilling story. So Camus, I think, is a great writer. And on to two contemporary writers, to sort of padding out my not quite in 5 and 6. So 5 is David Peace, writer of GB 1984, The Damned United, which gets in my all-time top 10 books. He's that, you know, that book is that good. But again, a bit like Winterson, Peace always writes in the same style, which is this sort of fantastic, lyrical, rhythmic writing, and you can hear it in your head as you're reading it. Very repetitive, pounding out a rhythm. But his last book veered away from that side. It's called Patient X. And I didn't like it at all, unfortunately. Not because it tried to do something different. It just wasn't a very good book. And it was basically about a Japanese writer whose one of his short stories became the film Rashomon. But it just felt so personal and intimate to Peace. I felt excluded by it. So I'm really interested to see what his next book is. And the other thing about that book is Peace spends 6 months of the year living in Japan. He's married to a Japanese woman. And half of his books are set in Japan and half are not. And he had a Japanese trilogy, which books 1 and 2, Occupied City and Tokyo Zero, were great. And I was waiting for ages for the third book in the trilogy, and it never came. And then this Patient X came out, which I think he and his publisher says, oh, well, this is the third in the trilogy, but it isn't. I think he couldn't write the third for whatever reason, and this happened to be a book set in Japan, so they co-opted it to complete the trilogy. But it, you know, I don't buy that, and I felt a bit cheated by it. And the last author, and they're not quite, is Jonathan Lethem, an American author who writes a lot of books. I mean, he's very prolific. And, you know, he's sort of, you know, literary fiction with a slight stoner twist, maybe. He's obsessed with Superman comics from when he was growing up in the 60s. So on the one hand, he can write quite a straight novel like Dissident Gardens, which I think is basically the story of the sort of left-wing community that he grew up in, and that his mother was an activist in. And then he'll write something like Chronic City, which is a total stoner's book, and The Book of New York, and it's a wonderful book with some fantastic ideas and metaphors in it. But each Lethem book is anew, you know, it almost has no connection with kind of what's come before from it, which I think is a strength. I think that talks to his ability to write different types of books. But as a collection as a whole, it's a very mixed bag, which is why I couldn't sort of put him as one of my favourites, but nearly there. Okay, so those were my not quite authors. So just go through them again. William Burroughs, Sam Shepard, Jeanette Winterson, Albert Camus, David Peace and Jonathan Lethem. So the next category, which I didn't really understand, is the maybe. So maybe these are my favourite writers. Well, I've got a pretty strong idea who my favourite authors are. So I'm not quite sure what the category maybe is. So as best as I could, I decided it was authors who are still writing, in the main, not all of them. So future books may elevate them into my favourite category status. So, for example, I'll start with Laurent Binet, who so far has only had 2 of his novels translated into English, HHHH and The Seventh Functional Language. Both brilliant books. Seventh Functional Language was my book of the year 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, whenever it came out. And HHHH is pretty up there. And I've got in-depth reviews of both, and I'll post them. I love Laurent Binet. He's clever, he's funny, but there's only 2 books to go on, so let's see what else he produces, and he may well sort of elevate to my favourite status. The next is Valeria Luiselli, much the same thing. She's written a few more than Binet, but I've only read 2. I've read the inestimable Lost Children Archive, which will almost certainly be my book of the year this year. And I've also read The Story of My Teeth by her, which was quite charming. And I read her non-fiction book, Tell Me How It Ends, which is the precursor to the Lost Children Archive. And they're, fantastic. But again, I need to see what the future holds for Luiselli to see whether she's, makes the leap. Next one, Don DeLillo. A bit like I was describing Lethem, I mean, DeLillo does write very similar style in all his books and has a huge catalogue. I've read everything by him that's fiction except Libra and Ratner's Star. And some of them are superb, like Cosmopolis is great, Underworld is great. I liked his sort of more recent books as well, so Point Omega, Falling Man and Zero K. And you can tell a Don DeLillo book by the style. But he's not quite... it's a maybe. I don't think he can write future books that are going to elevate into my all-time favourite. But, he's an important writer for me. I universally love his work. But there's something just holds back because his style isn't, he's very abrupt style, and he himself says in an interview that sometimes his word choices are governed not by what the word means but by the sound of the word. So I do really like him and I do really like the ideas, but sometimes I feel I'm missing something with DeLillo. I can't sort of make it any more explicit than that. And finally, someone who cannot elevate themselves into sort of the top category because they're dead, and that is Samuel Beckett. And the reason for that I've put him in this category is because there's Samuel Beckett the playwright and Samuel Beckett the novelist, and I'm much more familiar with Samuel Beckett the playwright from my playwriting days, where I've read all his short plays. I've seen and read Endgame and Waiting for Godot, Not I, Happy Days, endless of his plays, and they're terrific. I mean, no one gets theatre and the art of theatre and the artifice of theatre and the metaphor of theatre itself like Samuel Beckett did. And theatre is a metaphor for life itself, what Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. And Beckett enfleshed that through his work, I feel. And universally, his plays are just wonderful. And of course, he was very active in overseeing how they were staged, and famously wouldn't let a single, full stop be changed and all this sort of stuff. And then there's Beckett, the novelist, who I'm much less familiar with. I have read Malloy. I'm going to read Malone Dies, hopefully this year. Then next year I'll read the what's it called? Unforgiving, Unspeakable, Unnameable, I think it's called. I've also got What to read and Murphy. So I'm just withholding judgment because I've only read one of his novels. So those are my 4 maybes, of which Laurent Binet, Valeria Luiselli can definitely leap into the favourite category in future, and Beckett could once I get round to reading his novels. And Don DeLillo is unlikely to, but just that whole body of work I hold in high regard. So finally on to my 5 favourite authors, which are supposed to rank in order, so I'm going to go from the bottom up. Let me say, I guess most of these, if not all of them, all of them, well, not all of them because 2 of them are dead. If they have a new book coming out, I drop everything and I read that. And that will be the case later this month, when my 5th place is Michel Houellebecq's new novel called Serotonin Drops. Now, Houellebecq is not a perfect author by any means, and from a literary perspective there are some gaping flaws in his work, but no one to my mind, as a fiction writer, grapples with big themes, big social, philosophical, moral even themes, like Houellebecq does, and that makes him a really important writer for me. So a book like, what was it called, his last one, Submission, posits the Islamic party winning a French election. They're not radical Islamic, but they do want to have Sharia law. And therefore, if you work for the French state, we all know how sort of bloated the French state is in terms of employing people. If you want to continue working for the French state, you have to convert to Islam. And the character, who's very much a Houellebecq himself, is an academic teaching at a French university, therefore employed by the government, is sort of battling with, should he convert or not. And it's a brilliant treatment of what is faith, and about morality. He gets advice from all sorts of people in his circle. And the ending, the decision he makes, is influenced because he's lonely and he wants love. It's just brilliant. So I know a lot of people don't like Houellebecq and say he's misogynist and all this sort of stuff and racist. To me, his work can certainly be interpreted as that, but I actually think he's offering genuine, worthwhile explorations of these themes. So his new book comes out at the end of the month, and whatever I'm reading at the time, I will drop and start that. Number 4, David Markson. Now, what I love about Markson's later books is that they completely dismantle any notion of what you might have as what is a novel. 4 of his books are made up of epithets, sayings, bits of criticism, real words that have been said or written by real people. And the way he arranges them, and then little inserts of the writer characters in each of these, just, surprisingly perhaps, you get more insight into a character through that technique than you do in a 350-page Victorian novel, to my mind. Admittedly, we're talking about a character in the modern age, not in the Victorian period. They're so rich, they're so subversive. This is, they're not his words, they're other people's words, but they're his arrangement. They're not fiction, these were really written and said by real-life people. And yet he co-opts them into the service of fiction. I just think the work of David Markson is genius. Unfortunately, I don't have any of his works left to read in this vein. I've read all his later works when this is the technique he was doing. There are earlier works where I think they were sort of paid writing gigs, where he was sort of writing westerns and stuff. I'm not very interested in those. But, until someone gives me an insight into a different way of conceptualising the novel than David Markson does, he will remain in my top 5 pantheon of favourite writers. Number 3, Franz Kafka. Well, obviously, I can't drop anything to read the latest Kafka because there is no latest Kafka. But I have read everything by him, all his short stories, Letter to My Father, and the novels. And bear in mind that all the novels are not complete. He never actually finished a novel. His control in his novels is masterly. His choreography of characters, how he moves them around, in the case of the castle and in the case of the trial, of course, moving them around in the face of this great sort of choking wall of bureaucracy. And he writes relationships really, really well. The relationship between Kay and the woman in the castle, it's just very surprisingly moving. And just, you get, as a reader, you get these flows of sort of, yay, they're going to conquer the latest obstacle, and then, oh no, they've sunk down again. It's like snakes and ladders of the emotions. It's extraordinary work. And his short stories, very much like what I was describing for both Shepard and Beckett, the images in some of those short stories, like Metamorphosis, the guy who wakes up and he's turned into a bug, or the burrow where he's sort of anthropomorphized into a burrow-dwelling animal who has got this sort of paranoia about, the safety and security of his burrow that has to protect him from predators. I really recommend his short stories. They're quite parable-like. They're almost sort of something almost religious about them. the description of the wound in A Country Doctor is just brilliant. And so Kafka he's many things in his writing. And it's my one regret in life that I don't speak or read German at all, because I would love to read him in the original German, because apparently he's really funny, and that doesn't translate particularly well when translating from German to English. Position 2, Clarice Lispector, who, although she's dead, surprisingly does have 2 new books that are out this year, at least in terms of first time translated into English, and the second one comes out in November, and I'm looking forward to reading that. I've also got her first novel still to read, so I've read 2 of her novels this year so far, and I hope to complete all of her work by reading the last 3 that I haven't read next year. She's just a supreme stylist, a writer of ideas, of metaphysics, you know, what it is to be human, and you know, religion and morals. She's just, but it is really intense, her writing. You know, it's not something you can read, you know, while sunbathing on a beach. And you really have to, you know, her books are very short, but you have to take your time with them, because every sentence is just packed with sort of resonance and meaning. She's a fantastic writer, and I honestly don't think I can imagine her being knocked out of my favourite 5. But number 1, and someone who I would definitely drop whatever I was reading to read their next book, and that is Ben Marcus, who, a bit like Markson, does, not for the novels, the structure of a novel so much, but more for language. Nobody deals with language, how it works, how it doesn't work, what its shortcomings are, better than Ben Marcus. So the books like The Age of Wire and String and Flame Alphabet are just supreme examples of this. Now, his last 2 books have both been short story collections, and both pretty good, but I wonder if he's getting away from his work on language, because certainly the second collection, called Notes from the Fog, had very little to do with the language sort of probing that he did in his actual novels. The collection before that, Stories from the Sea, still did, very much so. So it'll be interesting to see which direction he goes from here, but he needs to write a book, you know, hopefully a novel. You know, maybe he has no more novels in him. Maybe he is now only left with short stories, because he's said what he has to say. So, in order, my 5 favourite writers: Ben Marcus, second is Clarice Lispector, third is Franz Kafka, fourth is David Markson, and fifth, and perhaps the most vulnerable to being bumped out by a future writer, Michel Houellebecq. Okay, so there you have it. Now, in tagging, Steve Donoghue very generously sort of threw out to every single person in the whole world. So everybody is tagged. I'm just repeating that. I'm not going to name specific people. Talk about your favourite books with these 3 categories, and maybe you can figure out the difference between not quite and maybe. Okay, till next time. Thanks very much.